Welcome to this guest lecture recording. My name is Christian Lamker and I'm happy to introduce you to Philippe Koch from the Institut Urban Landscape in Zurich, Switzerland, now talking about housing, politics and democracy, Zurich as an example. The recording is taken from the course City Matters, Urban Inequality and Social Justice at the University of Groningen Faculty of Spatial Sciences. Philippe gave this talk on 17th September 2024 together with Ross Beveridge, whom you can see in another recording. Now sit back, relax, and enjoy the presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation, and again, thank you for putting this together these 2 days. And I want to talk about housing policy in Zurich, but not in the sense of kind of discussing solutions, but more how housing policy kind of also is part of politics, and maybe also how people and actors involved in housing policy can contribute to democratize urban politics. So I'm not going to present kind of 5 solutions to solve the housing policy crisis, but I want to bring housing policy as an issue of urban politics. First of all, in order to talk about Zurich housing policy, I need to present some context material and to show you how the housing market functions and is structured in Zurich. And then I want to bring 2 points. The first one is around housing cooperatives, and ask what are housing cooperatives? What are housing cooperatives in relation to housing policy, but also in relation to democracy and housing politics. And then I want to talk a bit about direct democratic instruments and institutions in the context of global housing markets. So there is a certain kind of tension between the idea that we can govern ourselves and maybe also impact on the situation on the housing market, and on the other hand, so that would be kind of the democratic ideal. And on the other hand, we see that there is a housing market which is not, can be tamed by local democratic institutions. And then we move on to discussion. First of all, is anybody from Switzerland or know Switzerland? You know Switzerland? Are you Swiss?
No, my dad is Swiss.
Ah, really?
Partly.
Partly Swiss.
Yeah.
So, but then you all have kind of, maybe you have no idea of Switzerland, and some of you might have an idea of Switzerland. The usual kind of image that people have from Switzerland, even a lot of Swiss guys living in Switzerland, is the idea or a picture of that. So you have, well, the light is a bit bad, but you have mountains, you have old buildings, you have people coming together on a square. But it's not really an urban square, it's more like a square on the countryside. And they put up these yellow cards. It seems like an election or a votation. So that's a picture of the Landsgemeinde. That's, I don't know the term, it's an assembly twice a year in the canton of Glarus, a mountainous canton in Switzerland. And they decide twice a year on this kind of square the major issue of their kind of canton. And everybody gets, who is a citizen of that canton, gets a yellow card, and then there is a proposal, and then you can vote yes, or you can vote no. And so that's direct democracy, as it were. And there are still kind of certain places who are actually organized like that. And that's part of our kind of self-image of most of the Swiss people. They think we live still in this kind of situation, detached from the outside world through mountains, and have the spirit of self-organization. But the truth, or not the truth, another part of the story is, of course, that Switzerland is highly an urbanized country. It used to be one of the first country in Europe that has been industrialized in the 17th and 18th century. And so Switzerland is really an urban country, similar to the Netherlands, but the self-image is quite detached from that. So 85% of the population actually lives in urbanized areas. So there's this kind of mismatch. On this map, you see all the colored areas are urbanized areas, and that in between are rural areas, but only 15% of the population actually live in these rural areas. What is also particular to the Swiss case when you talk about housing is that it's really a country of tenants. So 65% of all the population are tenants, and it has the lowest ownership rate in Europe. It's roughly 30%, 35%, even though most Switzerland is well known for its wealth, and people usually, or a lot of people, are quite wealthy, but the ownership rate is quite low. And this is especially true in urban areas. More than 80% are tenants in all these urban areas, and when we look at Zurich, it's actually even 90%. So when we think of Zurich's housing market or the housing issue, it's a particular case of tenants. So what happens to tenants and how accessible is the housing market for tenants? So I have some facts and figures to get you an idea of what we're talking about. Here we have a comparison of the housing market in Zurich to other more or less big European cities. So Zurich has roughly 230,000 housing units with a population of 400,000 people. Only 8% of all housing units are owner-occupied. That's like the other side of the 90% tenants. We have 7% public housing. That means housing owned and run by the municipality or the canton, but most of them are run by the municipality. And then we have 80% of not-profit housing, and in Zurich that's run by housing cooperatives. And the private rental market is 2/3 of all people live in housing units they rent, and they are private and they are for profit. And when we compare that to Amsterdam, for instance, so the figures are taken from this report by André Holm and his colleagues on municipalism in practice about housing, and we can see, I think, one of the most important figures is that one. So how many people, how many tenants have to rent their homes in the commodified market, in a private commodified market. And we can see a quite different allocation around Europe, where we have Barcelona, which really relies on home ownership. So 60% live in their own kind of apartments, and a different model in Vienna, where we have roughly half of all housing units are social or public or not-profit housing, and only 1/3 has to find a flat in the privatized commodified market. So these are quite different conditions. Yeah.
Can I ask a quick question? Who owns all those houses then?
Here.
Yeah.
It's 40% are natural persons like you and me. I don't own one, but and the other 30%, it's equally 35% natural persons and 35% are companies, so pension funds, investment funds, but also insurance companies, construction companies. So it's half-half. It used to be, I have another slide afterwards, you will see it. So, but that's quite important to know that the housing market in Zurich really relies on these kind of rental, private rent. And that's exactly kind of the answer to your question. So when we look at the development of how the housing units are distributed across different ownerships, we can see that 40 years ago, 50% of all housing units were owned by natural persons, natürliche Personen in the Swiss law. These are kind of singular individual persons. And for-profit companies were owning 1/4, and housing cooperatives in public ownership, you can see it hasn't really changed. What actually has changed is the distribution between those two kind of ownership owners, property owners. And especially in the last 10 years, since the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, which was experienced by Swiss population and Swiss economy not as a crisis, but the other way around. So much capital flew into Switzerland that we had extremely growth rates, especially in the real estate market. So it has never been built that much within so many years, so few years, like in the last 10 years, and mostly by for-profit companies. They either built new apartments or they bought from natural persons. So that's what a lot of scholars would call financialization of the real estate market. So natural persons who own a house, maybe with 12 or 16 flats, they have an interest that the use value of the house and the apartments remains intact, because they cannot rely just on more value of the land, but they have to actually rent it out to pay their bills as well. So natural persons usually are more interested in the use value of a house and an apartment, and for-profit companies usually are more interested in the exchange value of a house. So that's kind of shifted the balance. So, and there is also, when we see a kind of this tension of a commodification of the housing market from here to here, there's this question of how this kind of impacts on the affordability of housing. And there's one kind of idea or conceptual kind of way to think about it is, the more a housing market is integrated into a commodified market, the less affordable are the houses. And public housing is the least integrated into market economy. You can read that slide as a kind of a thesis that you can work with and see if it actually fits to different contexts. The affordable housing policy mechanisms that are available to most kind of cities have been conceptualized and systematized by Balmer and Gerber, two Swiss scholars. Actually, Balmer is now not a scholar but an activist in Basel, and Gerber is now professor in Bern. And there are different ways to provide or subsidize housing so that it becomes affordable. So on the highest level are just kind of the negotiations, one could say, with different investors, but also with housing cooperatives that help maybe to produce affordable housing. I think the situation that we saw this morning goes in this direction. In my understanding, it's going to be a private-public partnership of sorts. So the public has some leeway to demand affordable housing from the private investors, but it's not really based on a regulation or a law, so it's difficult to actually implement it, but there is a certain way to negotiate with them. And then you can subsidize the supply of housing stock, so the production of housing stock, or you can subsidize the demand, so you can subsidize tenants. So these are the main mechanisms at hand, and in Zurich we can see that the principle is the promotion of non-profit housing. That means in Zurich a housing based on a cost-rent model. So the owner of a home and of housing units can only demand a rent that kind of replaces the cost, or how do you say that? Is as high as the cost of the housing that he has to pay. So it doesn't make any profit. That's the kind of idea. And it's defined by a law in the municipal law, how it is kind of quantified and calculated. So that's the principle. And the means are first public housing. We saw it's like 7 to 8% of all housing units are public housing. And then there is different ways of supporting and subsidizing non-profit housing developers. That's in the Swiss case, in the Zurich case, that's essentially housing cooperatives. And the subsidies are not kind of cash or capital based, it's through different mechanisms to support those. Maybe one of the most important ones are these ground leases. The ground leases is quite an interesting instrument because it also helps us to reflect on property relation. Ground leases is the land on which the house will be built remains in the property of the municipality, but they give it out to housing cooperatives for a lease, and they have to pay something to the municipality. And after 90 years or 50 years or 100 years, depending on the contract, the land goes back to the municipality. So the municipality does not lose the land or does not sell the land, but it's not depending on developing the land on its own. But it can hand it over to. Is that a policy that is known in the Netherlands also? Ground leases?
Erbpacht in Dutch. Or Erbpacht in German.
Erbpacht, exactly, in German. And
Erbpacht in Dutch. Not too common, but it's used.
Yeah. So, and when we look at how that plays out, kind of these affordability policies, it's quite interesting to. I just at the kind of more or less the most recent figures for a monthly rent of a 4-room apartment in the city of Zurich, and different apartments. One, the rents for a newly built apartment, then the rents of an existing building, and the contract, the rent contract. Is shorter than 2 years, and then a long-term rental contract, because that kind of gives you also an impression of the rental laws. And then there's a difference between the not-for-profit developers and the for-profit developers. And these are the rents you have to pay for a 4-room apartment, and you can see that. It is when the building is quite old and the tenant has a long contract or lives for a while in the apartment, the difference is not so, it's like double the price, but it kind of lowers the longer you live in an apartment. But in the new build, like those in the last 5 to 10 years, it's not only double, it's even more than double the price. So you have a big difference between the not-for-profit developers and the for-profit developers. And keep in mind that it shifted from natural persons to companies. So even more people or more companies are developing these strictly for-profit. And now we know how the ratio is, how the monthly rent, how high it is. And now I have added the monthly income for 2 different groups of people. One is for family household, and the other one is for single-parent household. And I think the general idea is that if the rents are more than 1/3 of the monthly income, it's not considered affordable. So affordability is somewhere usually a quarter to 1/3 of the income. Should be paid or could be maximally paid for rent, otherwise it's not really affordable. And so we have the family households which earn more than single-parent household, and divided by a poor neighborhood and affluent neighborhood. We could discuss the definitions of those, but it doesn't really matter. And then the ratio of the rent and the income. And you can see that the family household in both kind of neighborhoods kind of works. It's more or less, and that's the median rent, so it's not the new rent. It's like the median rent, it doesn't kind of work. But for single parents, it's just not it can be affordable even in the poor neighborhood with a non-profit kind of rent. Yeah.
This doesn't consider utilities, or it's just, or does it consider utilities?
It's just a netto rent. It's not. Yeah. It's called.
So what's in a four-room flat? Because depending on some
Yeah.
include kitchens and so on, some
Yeah.
don't.
A four-room flat, usually in cooperative housing, public housing, in a four-room flat, there must be at least 3 people living in it. So there is kind of an occupation regulation. So there are 3 bedrooms usually in a four-room flat. So even when you live in a non-profit and a single parent, they're struggling to pay their rent and especially to find an affordable home. And even though that salaries in Switzerland are quite high, but a single parent household, they usually have just one salary and maybe get some subsidies, but it's difficult to see. So that's one aspect. The other aspect, which is also has nothing to do with the current situation, is just the speciality of affordable housing. As I said, there is the main provider of affordable housing is our housing cooperatives and public housing, and that's the city of Zurich. And the darker the dots, the older the buildings, and the brighter the color, the newer the building. And the affordable and the non-profit housing schemes are here. The greens are for housing cooperatives, purple, public housing, and yellow, some non-profit foundations. And you can see that most of them were developed after the Second World War. So it's not concerns the inner core of the city, the middle-aged city, but here when the city expanded after the Second World War, there is a lot of housing cooperatives, and also in the more poor regions in the north. So there is also speciality and temporality of those. So that's kind of maybe a primer, a short introduction into the housing market in Zurich. And I think 2 questions that I find quite interesting, also in my own research, is this question of what are housing cooperatives? You can find some definition for that. It's based on self-help. It has a non-profit status. It's autonomous. It's participatory and democratic, depending a bit on the culture of each housing cooperative. And there is this idea of external solidarity, so that even though they're built on self-help, there should be kind of an aspiration to change also the livelihood or the access to affordable housing for those who are not members of the housing cooperative. So that's kind of a way to define it. And then we can see when were the kind of the high times of housing cooperatives. And that's a graph that shows the number of housing units built over the last 150 years by owner. So there are 2 major kind of phases that the housing cooperative was really important. After the First World War and then after the Second World War, due to the economic crisis, nobody wanted to invest. Or not nobody, but the investment was different. And then there was a long period of not decline, maybe slightly decline, but also kind of a maintaining the housing stock that was already there. And since 20 years, there is an increase again of the production of housing stock by housing cooperatives. So the historical development kind of mirrors this kind of production of housing. And what is interesting is you can see most of the phases. What is interesting is since the late 80s, there is a reactivation of the cooperative housing movement. and as an alternative form of housing, not just as a production of housing similar to for-profit housing, but really as being born out of the youth movement of the 80s and the squatters movement. They realized that maybe housing cooperative could be one way to realize a different form of living in the city. And even though those housing cooperatives were not the mass producer of housing units, they kind of inspired also the old-fashioned housing cooperatives to rearrange their own vision of what they wanted to build. If they still wanted to build just for single breadwinner families, Swiss families, or if they want to build for different forms of life, for alternative forms of life. So what this kind of, since the late 80s, what this kind of transformation or change suggests is that housing cooperatives might be more than just kind of an instrument for a housing policy, but they can kind of understand themselves as actors of a different form of housing and a different form of housing politics as such. So they are much more much more active in housing politics in terms of electoral politics, but also in terms of direct democratic instruments. And they have a much kind of ambitious idea of external solidarity and who they want to give housing opportunities. So housing cooperatives are not just maybe not just a policy instrument, but actually a political agent. And that's something which is maybe quite profane, but I think it's important because most of the planners and also most of the policy makers think of actors in instrumental way. How can actors help me to find and implement a solution? But they don't think about their own kind of logic of these actors and what they might turn into, or what they might, if they might be helpful in a different time or for a different kind of policy domain. So it's quite interesting to think of actors and instruments not only as actors and instruments, but also as kind of something of their own. Kind of, they have their own politics behind them or in them. So that's the first case, and the second case is much more. It's much shorter and much more disturbing, maybe. In Switzerland, as I said at the beginning, there is kind of a long tradition of direct democratic involvement. So it's possible on the federal level, on the cantonal level, and on the local level to collect signatures for a proposal, for a political proposal, and that will come on the ballot. And it's also possible to collect signatures against government proposal, and that will come on the ballot. So there are a lot. I just this weekend, or when I was in Groningen, a friend of mine and my sister texted me, what shall I vote on this and that, because they think I'm an expert in everything. And I said, I don't know. So I have to kind of vote like 15 times a year on different proposals, on different levels. So it's kind of intense, and you have to read a lot, and you have to debate a lot and discuss a lot. So that's a tradition, and we celebrate that in our strange ways. And so I collected, or I made a list of all the popular votes on housing in Zurich between 2010 and 2024. So in 2010, that was kind of a major initiative, more affordable housing, which set the goal for the municipality that 1/3 of all housing units should be non-profit. That's a target now. And after that, a lot of initiatives came on the ballot. Housing benefit schemes, I need to. Then new housing policy principles, 2013, new foundations for affordable ecology housing. That's a new foundation, new public housing development, etc., etc. And usually, because Zurich is also a green left city, all these proposals will have a large majority of yes votes, usually over 60%, over 2/3. So that's the first slide. Then the second slide, new public housing development, housing benefit scheme, non-profit housing project, new public housing schemes, always over 60%, 66%. And then in the last 4 years, new legal competences for the city council to buy land, new public housing, renovation of existing public housing, new public housing, purchase of development site. That was kind of a tricky one, only 51% yes, because it was a development site of the Swiss railway company, and they wanted to build affordable housing, but only 25%, and the left demanded 35%, so they put that on the ballot, and the majority of the Zurich citizens said yes, so the Swiss railway company did not build the affordable housing, nor did anybody else. So it's kind of a deadlock situation. And then a new public housing fund of 300 million Swiss francs, which should enable the building of affordable housing, and then more housing for elderly people, 91% yes. So we have, I don't know, I didn't count them, but more than 20 initiatives, public, direct democratic kind of demands, with a majority supporting it. And still, we have the situation that I described earlier, with a lack of affordable housing, increase of companies owning. So, clear position on voters on the housing issue, and yet housing is becoming less and less affordable. And now I'm going to give the question back to you, and maybe you can help me explain that phenomenon. Or maybe the experts over there.
Okay, but we have the equal opportunity to give a very large applause again to Philippe, to Ross, for 2 parts of a lecture, also reflective on what we have seen this morning, with a bit of more an abstract view on housing markets, on urban democracy. So we can have many more debates about the fundamentals of planning, property, ownership, housing markets, politics, democracy. Let's do that. Thanks again, and see all of you tomorrow for another seminar with Sander.